So I wanted to take a moment and talk about what's been going on with Kanye West and anti-Semitism more broadly, and some of the other stories that are in the news. This is going to be a little bit of a rant, so apologies in advance if my thoughts are not fully formed, but I have a lot to say on the issue. So, for those of you who don't know, I'm Jewish, my family's Jewish. I personally identify as a Jew who is also an atheist. I've spoken about this before. Happy to make a longer video about how that works. But it's not uncommon for a number of Jews to identify as secular. The Jewish people, in many ways, is an ethnic group, a cultural group, as much as it is a religious group. And many Jews, especially in America, but also around the world, even in Israel, identify as a member of the Jewish community, identify as Jews, but are not themselves religious. So just want to get that out of the way. Everything that Kanye West has been saying is clearly anti Semitic. Flat out, you can't deny that what he's been saying is anti Semitic. And he's not alone, right? A lot of people say similar things to what Kanye West has been saying. The Jews run the world, the Jews run the media, the Jews run the banks, etc., etc., etc. In this country, Jews only make up about 2.4% of the population. It's a pretty small minority when you compare it to other groups, especially from a ethno-cultural group, not just a religious group. And it's, many people don't fully understand the Jewish community. They don't understand Jewish history. They don't understand the Holocaust. And it's mainly because, our education system in this country is awful. And we don't get enough of that education, unfortunately. But many people in this country have never met a Jewish person in their lives. So they have no way to identify who Jews are or what they represent or what kind of people they are. And obviously not all Jews are the same. You can't lump any group or any, individual into a giant category. But when you've never met a single person from a certain group, whether that's a religious group, an ethnic group, a cultural group, a racial group, etc., you obviously don't know much about them. So much of us, as humans, our human existence is from interaction and communication and dialogue. And so when there isn't that, it's very difficult for people to identify who Jews are in their immediate life. And I'll give you an example. I grew up on Long Island, New York. There's, lots of Jews in certain parts of Long Island. But when I was a younger kid, when I was going to elementary school, I was the only Jew in my class. I remember very vividly, every year doing like a Hanukkah celebration and teaching the kids about, some of the other Jewish holidays. And I went to camp, and many Jews, especially in the greater New York area, go to, summer camps. And that's where the Jews were, because I went to a camp that was connected to a JCC, a Jewish Community Center. Um, and in my world, like those two things were separate. Like there aren't Jews at school, but there's Jews at camp. Like that's where, those two worlds kind of divide. And it wasn't until I moved to another community later that I realized, oh, there's other Jews like in schools. It's just not, not just at camp. And so then for most of the rest of my, young adult life growing up, like there are other Jews that were in my community, in my high school, in my middle school, etc. But when I went to college, I went to the University of Connecticut, and I met a number of people at the University of Connecticut that had never met a Jew before in their lives and heard a lot of anti-Semitic comments from people in passing, not usually directed at me directly. That would have been a pretty big mistake for people to do. But usually, just in passing. And sometimes I would call them out for it. Sometimes I would just kind of, hey, you know what? I'm Jewish. And as somebody who didn't even identify really at all with the religion my entire, young adult life at all, never been religious. I started wearing a Star of David just to kind of like as a, like a badge, like, you know, watch your mouth, put people on notice. And, it's just interesting that it came so naturally for some of these people. And most of them had never met a Jew in their lives and were saying these anti-Semitic comments. They had these anti-Semitic beliefs. It was an easy target. Jews tend to be an easy target. And so we're in the situation where there's a lot of anti-Semitism in this country. There always has been. Some of it has been under the surface. A lot of it has come to the surface over the last few years for a number of reasons. But when you have somebody like Kanye West, who has a huge platform, people who have never identified with him before, he's out there saying certain things, people are going to listen. And some people identify with what he's saying, even if, again, they haven't met Jews before. Um, but it's dangerous. And I think what people don't understand, the other thing that you may not know about me is that um, my expertise is in genocide and mass atrocities prevention. Um, this painting over here is of Raphael Lemkin, who is a Polish Jewish lawyer, jurist, linguist. He was the man who coined the term genocide. He literally created the term towards the end of the Holocaust. He lost his entire family in the Holocaust. And people don't understand the Holocaust. They don't understand what happened to the Jewish people. They don't understand the history of Jews being targeted long before the Holocaust. Um, and they don't understand that genocide and other mass atrocity crimes don't happen overnight. These aren't things where on a Monday everything's fine and on a Tuesday a community decides, okay, we're now going to commit genocide against another group. There's leads up to this. And there's a great piece by Dr. Gregory Stanton, you could look it up online, called The 10 Stages of Genocide. And now we can go into a whole lesson about genocide and the 10 stages and everything else. But these stages are not meant to represent all genocides. They're not meant to represent, a certain order in which these things need to happen. But many cases, these kinds of things have a trajectory. There's a lead up to the atrocities. And dehumanization, polarization, discrimination, classification, all these kinds of things that are leads up to mass violence. And so when you have somebody that is sharing dehumanizing language against a population, when they're creating some sort of division in society, when they're blaming them, they're scapegoating them for problems, these are all things that we've seen before, and they don't usually end well, especially when they're not confronted. And when, unfortunately, people that are in positions of power subscribe to the same thinking and either share that messaging or tacitly agree with it by not condemning it. And so what we're seeing from Republicans, from people like Marjorie Taylor Greene talking about Jewish space lasers and all kinds of other stuff, not really understanding the Holocaust, her, Lauren Boebert, etc. You're seeing direct anti-Semitism from some leading members of Congress, some people who are running for Congress, the ex-president. But then you're also seeing a situation where, Republicans had been talking, and propping up Kanye West for, many weeks and months, years, that he was a, freedom of speech advocate and that, he shouldn't be silenced. And then now that he's been saying directly anti-Semitic things, they're silent. They're not condemning him. They're not calling him out. They're not saying this is wrong. Meanwhile, they're very quick to judge and to try to shame and blame the few Muslim members of Congress on the Democratic side and accuse them of being anti-Semitic, always. And when they're being criticized, Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar, it's usually because they are expressing criticisms of the state of Israel and Israel's policies and some of the crimes that the Israeli government is committing in the Palestinian territories. That is not the same thing. And the fact that Republicans are silent now in the face of the horrible anti-Semitic things that Kanye West has been saying, literally daring Adidas to kick him off, their agreement, which they finally did, losing millions of dollars. He's been deplatformed. He's been, multiple companies are severing ties with him, but yet Republicans won't call him out. And we're seeing his message, spreading. We're seeing it on TikTok. We're seeing it on social media. We're seeing it, the 405 in Los Angeles. People were hanging signs off the highway, off the overpass, saying Kanye was right. and sharing other anti-Semitic messages. He's being propped up by a lot of these individuals. Um, and it's scary. It's scary because the more that people get a permission window, the more that people see somebody in a position of power, in a position of influence and authority, say these kinds of things, it confirms for them what they've been thinking themselves or what they've heard or what they thought. Again, despite the fact that many of them have never met a Jewish person in their lives. So I say all this to say, be vigilant, pay attention to what's going on around you. Um, Go out and reach out. If you're one of these people who have never met a Jewish person in your life, there's ways to do that. There's ways to have dialogue with people. There may be a Jewish community not too far from you. I'm happy to have a dialogue with you. Would love to have a conversation with people who have questions, who have, things that they don't understand, that they want to learn more. But know that there's a reason why the Jewish community is often seen as the canary in the coal mine. And what I mean by that is usually when there are attacks against the Jewish people, there are anti-Semitic attacks, there are, propaganda that's being spread, and there's also physical attacks. It's usually a sign of a much larger problem. And so while we're seeing this increasing anti-Semitism, it's not just the hatred and the violence against Jews, but other groups as well. And targeted attacks against certain communities, targeted violence and permission is a real serious issue. When you have Kanye West and Candace Owens, wearing a White Lives Matter shirt and, going out there and spreading that kind of nonsense, again, it's a permission window. Oh, they're black, they're saying it, so it's okay that we say it, that we believe it. What's amazing is, you have somebody like Dennis Prager, who's a Jewish person who runs PragerU and has, Candace Owens on his platform, kind of helped to bring her up as a rising star in the conservative crazy movement. And yet her affiliation with somebody like Kanye doesn't seem to bother him. There's a real issue that we have where certain individuals are willing to brush aside things that they wouldn't normally if it furthers their agenda. And we see that with Christian evangelicals in this country, with Christian nationalists who would embrace somebody as flawed as Donald Trump, who clearly does not at all adhere to Christian principles, or at least what they're actually written about. And yet they view him as their savior, which is crazy. So like I said, this is a long rant. I can go on and talk about a number of other things, but just know that while you're silent in the face of any kind of hatred, any kind of division, any kind of targeted attacks, you're part of the problem. And if you don't understand these things and you want to learn more, there's plenty of resources out there. I'll try to link some below. But be better. Don't be part of the problem. Be part of the solution. Choose peace and human rights and justice and equality over hate and indifference and apathy and division. Because, we're all in this together to some degree. And we need to be able to do better for each other.